From the heartland of America, the gateway to the West, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be across the nation, around the world. I'm George Norrie, and welcome to Coast AM. First of all, a happy birthday to Sky in Seattle, Washington, from her mother, Raquel. Split show for you tonight. Later on, triangular-shaped UFOs, classics. And don't forget, we'll be having live shows for you on Independence Day and on Friday as well, both national holidays. We'll be here for you. Here's what's happening. Drone strikes, billed by President Barack Obama as tactically surgical and the less likely to create deadly civilian damage and deaths than conventional air power. Yeah, however, according to a survey, they are 10 times more likely to cause innocent casualties than bombs or missiles unleashed from U.S. jets, according to a new study based on classified military documents. So there you have it. Jets cause less damage to civilians than drones. And they're planning 30,000 drones to fly over America. Egypt's army has removed President Mohamed Morsi from power, suspended the constitution, and pledged new elections following mass protests. The army chief announced the move in a television address. Now, the head of the Constitutional Court is expected to be sworn in as the interim leader on Thursday, only for a short time. Mr. Morsi's supporters denounced the move as a military coup and said that he was being held in detention. His opponents celebrated through the night, but officials from Mr. Morsi's Muslim Brotherhood said its main ally in Cairo had come under attack by armed assailants, and there were reports of deadly clashes elsewhere. Egypt right now is in a state of turmoil. It is in a mess. Keep in mind, Morsi was no Boy Scout, yet he was the elected person that most of the Egyptians wanted in. Now they're not happy with him, and he apparently is out. Ryan Morrow, of course, is founder of WorldThreats.com and also heads up the ClarionProject.org. Let's check in with him on the Egyptian situation. How tense is it, Ryan, or is the media blowing it out of proportion?
It's extremely tense, but not as tense as it was over the weekend. And that's because this has been a victory for the opposition. This is actually a great day for the majority of Egyptians. This is being called a coup, and that may fit some definition in some dictionary, but the military stepped in because the majority of Egyptians asked them to. So for the President Morsi may have been democratically elected, but that doesn't mean that he led a democracy.
Did he basically trick the people, Ryan, when he got elected?
Oh, yeah, without a doubt. The Muslim Brotherhood has done this type of thing for a long time, where they manipulate words, they play games of semantics. There's even quotes from them openly talking about how lying is justified according to their religious point of view.
So let's see now what will happen. They'll have some new elections, and maybe a solid candidate will come forward and win, and maybe we can get some peace in Egypt. What do you think?
Right, and that's the direction that it seems to be headed in. Basically, this is the biggest blow to the Muslim Brotherhood since the group was founded in 1928 in Egypt, because now they've been defeated in the realm of popular opinion, which before they had to be defeated through force. So this is a really, really big development.
Okay, and Ryan's website again, ClarionProject.org. You can find it on our Twitter feed at coasttocoastam.com. Bolivia has accused European countries of an act of aggression for refusing to allow its presidential jet into their airspace amid suggestions that the U.S. fugitive Edward Snowden was aboard. Bolivia said France, Italy, Spain, and Portugal had blocked the plane from flying over their territory. President Evo Morales was flying back to Bolivia from Moscow when the plane was forced to stop in Vienna. The jet was reportedly searched for Mr. Snowden, wanted for leaks in the U.S., He was apparently not on board and is still believed to be in Moscow's airport, from where he is seeking asylum to Bolivia or several other countries, any country that would take him. There's a new tick-borne illness that could be worse than Lyme disease. Already it has infected 100,000 New Yorkers since that state first started keeping track. The common deer tick is capable of spreading dangerous germs into the human blood system with its bite. However, Lyme disease is one of the many diseases that ticks carry. The latest disease is related to Lyme's disease, and an infected person will suffer similar symptoms. An environmental group said that the caramel coloring used in Pepsi still contains a worrisome level of a carcinogen, even after the drink maker said that it would change its formula. Now, in March, Pepsi and Coca-Cola said that they would adjust their formulas nationally after California passed a law mandating drinks containing a certain level of the carcinogens come with a cancer warning label. The charges were made for drinks sold in California when the law passed. The chemical, which can form during the cooking process and result, may be found in trace amounts in many foods. The watchdog group, the Center for Environmental Health, found that via testing that while Coca-Cola products no longer test positive for the chemical, Pepsi products sold outside of California still do. 7 or more hours of sleep a night boosts the benefits to the heart of a healthy lifestyle, according to research. They said, of course, exercise, diet, drinking, and smoking, keeping those away, those will reduce deaths from heart disease or stroke. But if you sleep a lot, it's better for your heart. Prescription pain pill addiction was originally seen as a man's problem, a national epidemic that began among workers doing backbreaking labor in the coal mines and factories in Appalachia. But a new analysis of federal data has found that the deaths in recent years have been rising far faster among women, jumping since 1999. More women now die of overdoses from pain pills like OxyContin than from cervical cancer or homicide. Dr. Peter Bregan, no fan of over-medicating America, with us. Well, here's an interesting study that backs up everything you've said, Peter.
Yeah, I think we've got three different aspects to this because I think it's very important that you're covering it. First is the big picture, because remember, wasn't long ago you and I were talking about the greatly increased suicide rate among older men, this shift to older men. And now we have women, and it's again that age group that is dominating, overdosing, most of them not conscious suicides, but overdosing on painkillers, often, half the time in combination with other drugs, including psychiatric drugs. And it's that age group of 45 to 64. And again, common with what we talked about earlier, George, a lot of these people are poor. They're under economic pressure. The poor are 6 times more likely to end up overdosing on pain meds and probably other meds. And a large percentage of these folks are on Medicaid. Some studies showing 40% of these people who are overdosing are on Medicaid. So that's a part of it. Then the second issue is that we're filling this gap of despair among men and women with the drugs. And we've talked a lot about that. 75% of the ODs are on pain meds, but that leaves 25% on other drugs. And half of the ones on the pain meds are on psych drugs or benzos or related drugs. And then there's the challenge to women, because men went up, George, 265% in their ODs during this time, women 400%.
Wow.
It's bad for both. And I think we are not responding to the situation of women. We're not listening to the situation of women, especially when they're going to doctors, who are in a lot of stress now with the breakup of the family, with economic issues, with really despair hitting more and more. That's what we're seeing, these people who are in their 40s, 50s, and 60s. And you go to the doctor now, and my final word on it, and I'll take a breath. My final word on it, the people who are giving these drugs out are mostly not specialists. They're GPs, they're internists, and the pain meds are also dentists. And what's happening is when the women are going to doctors, no one's listening.
Good point.
They're not listening to the men, and they're not listening to the women, I think in particular, who would respond to some kindness, some interest, something else other than a doctor sitting behind a computer figuring out how he's going to deal with all the insurance issues, and giving out a prescription. We got to start listening. That's another one of the messages.
We should too. Dr. Peter Bregan, one of his books, Medication Madness. Peter, you have yourself a wonderful 4th of July weekend with your family. And listen in on Coast to Coast because we will be here live. Senator Richard Durbin of Illinois wants to reintroduce a supplement bill. Now, this bill, of course, would grant the FDA more power to regulate supplements as if they were drugs, potentially putting supplement companies out of business. In a moment, Attorney Jonathan Emord joins us. We'll talk about this story and how it affects you for a couple hours. The remains of a New York school teacher who disappeared nearly 28 years ago have been discovered hidden in a false basement wall in the house where she lived with her husband. Joanne Nichols was 55 years old when her husband James reported her missing back in 1985. Police in New York said that they couldn't find her. He said that he died of natural causes. He said he didn't know where she went. In what seems like a scene from an Alfred Hitchcock movie, real-life angry birds are attacking a British town, prompting mail carriers to stop even their deliveries. Residents of Cornwall have been instructed to personally go to the post office on their own to collect their mail. They have no idea why these birds are attacking adults, kids, dogs, you name it. They're coming after all of them. The Loch Ness Monster. I happen to think something's in that nest. However, a scientist says that it's interesting that the reports of Nessie seem to pop up and they're accompanied by earth tremors and swirling bubbles from the Scottish lake. He thinks it has to do with some geology fault. Who knows? In a moment, Jonathan Emord joins us. We'll talk about the supplement bill on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. I'm George Norrie. As I mentioned, Senator Richard Durbin of Illinois wants to reintroduce his supplement bill, which will give the FDA more power to regulate supplements as if they were drugs. Jonathan Emord, principal of Emord and Associates, practices constitutional and administrative law in Washington, D.C. He has fought and defeated the FDA a number of times, and here he is for a couple hours here on Coast to Coast AM. Jonathan, here they go. They're coming after supplements now, huh?
Well, that's true, George. Good to be with you. Dick Durbin from Illinois is a regular fighter against supplements. I mean, he's been around year after year after year banging the same drum. And, it's a hypocritical position for him because here you have all of this adverse safety information about unsafe drugs. Most recently, for example, Brisdell is a drug for moderate to severe symptoms of menopause, just approved on June 28th, and was approved by the FDA commissioner over the objection of the FDA's drug advisory panel, and has a terrible safety profile. And this is typical of the agency approving unsafe drugs, and the agency is pretty much a captive of the drug industry, and yet Durbin doesn't say anything about that, where the real problem lies at FDA. Instead, he focuses over and over again on trying to restrict consumer access to dietary supplements, trying to drive supplements out of the market, try to reclassify supplements as drugs. And George, when you look at the safety profile of supplements and you compare them with drugs, virtually no one dies in the United States from ingesting dietary supplements, whereas over 200,000 people a year on average die from taking prescription drugs in accordance with a prescription. So this double standard makes no sense, and Durbin's Dietary Supplement Labeling Act, which he's going to introduce either Friday or sometime next week, is another example of how this senator really wants to do a number on consumer access to supplements.
Jonathan, I don't have any problem with some kind of watchdog watching the quality of the supplements that we can buy without prescription. But, of course, if they're prescribed or if you got to go to a doctor for them, then I got an issue with that. What are we doing right now as a nation? Is anybody watching the companies? I know they've had problems out of China and some other areas who are making some of these supplements, putting them on the market, and they might not be any good. They might be harmful.
Well, there's an enormous amount of pressure on supplement companies to ensure the integrity of their products. It doesn't mean that there aren't charlatans out there. There are. And there are also charlatans in the drug business, and there are people who make counterfeit drugs and so on. So it's not unique to supplements, and it's not unique to foods or drugs. It's characteristic of this whole market that there are a minority of folks selling bad stuff. But when it comes to the incentives, they're all in the right direction. The market incentives are there to ensure the safety and integrity of these products. The industry self-polices with its own trade associations, which ferret out bad actors and report them to the industry's own regulatory bodies and exposes them to the public. And as far as FDA is concerned, my goodness, there's an enormous amount of regulation. A lot of it misses the point. For example, I think most consumers would consider it logical to mandate finished product testing to ensure that there are no pathogens or other contaminants. And while that's a part of FDA's regulations in place, FDA regulates supplements almost as if they're fissile materials. It regulates the process by which supplements are made from source to finished product and requires minute recordation of every aspect of production and regulates every aspect of how these things are made, from where hand washing stations are located to the placement of product in warehouses, et cetera, to such an extreme degree and with such subjectivity that it can really arbitrarily, at political whim, shut down any dietary supplement company in the United States.
Jonathan, do we know why Senator Dick Durbin wants to get his bill passed? I mean, what's he after?
Well, Durbin's bill is really insidious and evil in this sense. It would give the FDA commissioner the power and the duty to require every supplement company in the United States to report every ingredient in their products and provide all the labeling that they use in the market, to be reviewed by the FDA commissioner for her creation of a list of products that, quote unquote, could cause potential risks. Of course, anything including water could cause a potential risk. So it gives her carte blanche, a total discretion at listing publicly supplements as dangerous based on no proof of actual injury. So you have to ask yourself, why is this senator so aggressively pursuing this? And it's very hard to understand. He certainly does favor regulation. He's been an advocate of regulation across the board, except when it comes to hammering the drug industry for its undue influence over the FDA. Now, it makes most sense that if you really do favor this corrupt existing system where the drug industry really does control the agency, you would try to hurt those parties that pose competitive threats to the industry. And one of those parties is the supplement industry. As people come to learn that they can reduce the incidence of disease or even prevent or even treat disease in certain circumstances with dietary supplements, they become less dependent upon drugs for every inconvenience or injury or illness. And that, even though it's not a significant competitive threat, is a competitive concern of the drug industry. So by doing this, whether he intentionally is doing it to advance the interests of drug companies or not, he is in fact doing that by imposing greater barriers and regulations and restrictions and costs on supplements than the industry can afford. And by not doing a job on drugs when that is the real source of injury to consumers.
Historically, the FDA has approved pharmaceutical drugs that then had to get yanked off the market. I mean, that's truly unbelievable. How does that happen?
Well, it is because of the undue influence of the drug industry. I mean, FDA's own director of the Office of Drug Safety, Associate Director of the Office of Drug Safety, Dr. David Graham, has said over and over again, has testified to Congress, as have many other FDA whistleblowers who are medical reviewers of the agency, that FDA views the drug industry as its quote-unquote client and advances that client's interests even at the extent of allowing unsafe drugs into the market. And this just happened on June 28th. I mean, Brisdell, which is a treatment for moderate to severe menopause symptoms, including hot flashes, was approved by FDA Commissioner Margaret Hamburg over the objection of FDA's Drug Advisory Council.
Of course, they always do that. Jonathan, we're coming back with more. We're going to talk about supplements, GMOs. I also want to get your reaction on the NSA surveillance. We'll be back. And Jonathan, before we get into some GMOs, and also I want to get your reaction to the Edward Snowden NSA case. So where does this Durbin supplement bill stand right now?
Well, he attempted to amend a prior bill, and that was defeated. He plans to reintroduce it either this Friday or the beginning of next week.
Does he have support in the Congress?
He has support, but I think the opposition is stronger, so I'm confident that, at least for the short term, he's not going to succeed. The thing about him, though, is that he doesn't give up on it. He keeps introducing it over and over again.
Oh, jeez. I guess he's allowed to do that, isn't he?
Yeah, he can introduce it as many times as he wants.
The NSA, Edward Snowden, I want your overall perspective. You're a constitutional lawyer. Did he have a right to do this to protect us?
He violated the law in doing this, and he is subject to prosecution. But clearly, by informing the American people that millions of Americans' email correspondence and phone records have been obtained by the NSA, he performed a service.
So by doing this, by doing what he did, and he came forward and said, hey, you know, I want the American people to know what's been going on. He's having a difficult time finding a country that wants to give him asylum. I would have thought somebody would have. Do you think there's some, behind-the-scenes tactics going on here by us?
Oh, sure. There's tremendous pressure being applied to those countries that are willing to listen, that the United States does not want this gentleman to be able to find asylum. And there's a huge spin operation being performed by the Obama administration to characterize him as a horror. At the same time, President Obama contradicts that position by saying that he's not going to take any extraordinary measures to get him. So it's a peculiar thing. If he really was such a tremendous threat to national security, you would expect every effort, including an attempt to intercept his aircraft and take him, would be employed by the Obama administration. Yet that's contrary to what the president says he's going to do. He basically says he's not going to do anything other than ask the countries to extradite him to the United States.
Hey, before I get into GMOs, I understand you're going to do your own little hourly radio show, huh?
Well, that's right. I'm going to try it a little bit, George. You're the expert, but I'm going to give it a shot. A GCNlive.com program called Jonathan E. Mort's Truth Trial.
Good for you.
And we're going to expose government corruption and abuse of power.
Okay, if you need any help, you let me know, okay?
I sure will. Thanks, George.
You're one of a kind. GMOs, where do we stand with GMOs? What's happening in Europe? What's happening here, Jonathan?
Well, there is a success to report on the GMO front, and I'm rather gratified by that because I was asked by Alliance for Natural Health U.S. to draft the bill that actually passed in Connecticut, the first state in the country to actually pass a GMO labeling bill. That's a huge success, and it enables it forms a model for the rest of the country. Under that bill, anything that is any food that is made with genetically engineered ingredients must include on the label that the product was made. Actually, the words are produced with genetic engineering, and that passed, and it's not implemented presently because there's a provision in the bill that looks for 4 other states to duplicate the action of Connecticut before Connecticut's kicks in, but still, it passed, and it's on the books, and it awaits 4 other states' ratification. Wish that weren't in there, but that was an amendment that they got through.
You know, so many people are concerned about GMOs and the safety of GMOs. I understand now that the manufacturers of these seeds, they're going to start fighting back. What's going on that front?
Well, Monsanto, leading the pack, is interested in preventing the public from realizing that the contents of foods contains GMOs. You know, something like 75% all canned vegetables in the United States are GMOs, and they don't have that on the label. The FDA protected the industry by a ruling that they didn't have to put that on the label. Now, this involves, I think, a classic case of defrauding people. When you have people who are interested in eating organic foods, and that becomes a distinguishing characteristic of whether they wish to purchase something, the failure to disclose the presence of genetic engineering disables them in the marketplace. They purchase products assuming them to be organic, for example, when in fact they may not be, and that is an act of legerdemain or fraud. It's a bait and switch in essence, and laws historically have prevented that sort of thing. This isn't a case where, as the industry would have it, a First Amendment violation is taking place. They say, look, this is compelled speech. If you force us to put on the label that ingredients are genetically engineered, you are engaging in compelled speech, and you're violating the commercial speech standard for free speech by doing this without any evidence that it's harming consumers, without any sound evidence. The answer to that, principally, is that this is not a viewpoint-based restriction of speech or compelling you to communicate a message that is other than the truth with regard to the content of the product. There's no, in this bill I wrote for Connecticut, there's no language in there that says the genetically engineered ingredient is bad for you or is harmful in any way. It just says that it's in there so that consumers can exercise freedom of choice in making a decision. In that respect, it is no different from nutrition labeling generally. For example, if you buy a product that has a nutrition facts panel on it, it shows you the vitamins and the minerals and other things in it that might be of import to your health. Well, for those who wish to consume a strictly organic diet, knowing which foods to avoid that are genetically engineered is important. And it's undeniable, even if you don't buy into science supporting the notion that there may be a problem here, it's undeniable that individuals with allergies to particular kinds of genetically modified foods have a keen interest in understanding that, in addition to wishing to eat organic.
We're with attorney Jonathan Emor talking about a number of issues that all affect all of us. Tell me about how you got involved in the Sandy Hook tragedy, the elementary school tragedy, and Adam Lanza.
Well, I was contacted by a group called Able Child, which is a group of caregivers, and what they do is they represent people who care for children with emotional problems, and among those problems are ones that involve, mental illness. And so as evidence began to arise from various states that these school shootings involve kids who were on psychoactive drugs, and by the way, that drug that the FDA just approved, Brisdell, is actually a serotonin reuptake inhibitor drug, which is paroxetine. So women are being asked to take the very drugs I'm about to talk about, which increase the risk of aggressive behavior and suicidality, among other.
And depression, right?
And depression, yeah. So what these caregivers were concerned about was that these kids might be given drugs that would cause them to be violent and would attack the caregivers. And since there had been evidence of some 31 school-related acts of violence from kids who were on these drugs, 162 were wounded and 72 killed from that, they were deeply concerned, and with good reason. So they wanted to get a body of scientists together, which they formed, to evaluate the evidence of the association between the taking of these kinds of drugs, which are known to increase the risk of aggressive behavior and suicidality and depression, and manic behavior and homicidal ideation, and see if there's a correlation between the taking of those drugs and the outburst of violence. And so they wanted the medical records, autopsy toxicological medical records of the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooter, Adam Lanza. They asked under the statute in Connecticut, if you have a legitimate interest, you're a member of the public, you are supposed to be able to acquire these records. And the medical examiner, without any explanation given, beyond a superficial denial,
Right.
refused to allow the information to be given. So we sued the medical examiner, and the case is pending before the Freedom of Information Commission in Connecticut.
You think you have a good chance?
I think we do. I think we satisfy the statutory requirement more than enough. I mean, my goodness, there's a pressing national need to know whether these drugs are involved.
Why didn't they want to freely give you the information?
It's inexplicable to me, particularly because they basically waived their argument. They have been giving out the information selectively to favored members of the media and to certain university groups and study groups. They just arbitrarily denied it to this Able Child group. Why they have a bias against Able Child, I don't know. Able Child is a good group. They represent the caregivers, and the information is vital to them. They want to know whether there should be a change in the protocol for these drugs so that kids who have either a prior history of violence or predisposition in that direction not be given these kinds of drugs that might exacerbate that problem. And if there is any sign of it while they're on it, that there be a protocol to wean them from these drugs. You know, these drugs have withdrawal symptoms that are significant. So the tendency is for kids, once they're on Paxil or Zoloft, Effexor, or these other drugs, to stay on them. And that's one of the horrible things about this Brisdell. I mean, women are going to be taking this for menopause. They're going to experience all kinds of things, which are actually worsening menopause: headaches, fatigue, nausea, vomiting, increases in aggressive behavior, hallucinations, coma, nervousness, flushing, tremors, seizures. I mean, and when they try to withdraw, when kids try to withdraw from these drugs, they have things like electric shock-like sensations, as women will have on Brisdell, in the brain, dizziness, lightheadedness, vertigo, anxiety, hostility, headaches. I mean, visual disturbances. The list is really quite extensive. So there's got to be a sophisticated awareness of what these drugs do and a medical protocol in place so that these caregivers can be protected, so that a doctor is not just continuously giving kids and older people these drugs in the presence of behavior patterns that suggest that it's causing the person to want to kill somebody.
That's unbelievable, Jonathan. I mean, it really is. I see that as probably one of the biggest factors of these tragedies that have occurred over the last several years.
I agree. I think it's a catalyst. You know, whether it is the major reason why or whether it is simply an additive factor, we have a right to know, and we have a need to know. And my goodness, we're all at risk. I mean, Paxil, Zoloft, Effexor, all of these Ritalin, all these drugs that are psychoactive drugs are being pushed out right and left to kids for all kinds of behavioral issues and adults. And are we creating a population that is saturated with individuals who are on the brink of blowing up because of these drugs? I mean, there's no even on this Brisdell, you know, the FDA approved a boxed warning statement on that menopause drug that alerts people to the increased risk of suicidality. I mean, we have to start thinking this over a little bit. The review panel at FDA voted 10-4 not to approve it. The FDA commissioner bowed to the drug company and approved the drug. And all these drugs are out there. FDA's own medical reviewer years ago looked at this situation and said, my goodness, there is an increased risk of suicidality. We've got to get these drugs off the market, or at least we've got to warn the whole medical community. FDA ostracized him and suppressed his report. Then Europe published the information. There's a whole bunch of information. 22 international drug regulatory agency warnings have been issued about these drugs, about them causing mania and hostility and aggression, violence, and homicidal ideation. And there have been between 2004 and 2011, there were 12,755 reports to FDA's MedWatch system that these psychiatric drugs cause violent side effects. And 1,231 of them were cases of homicide or homicidal ideation, 2,995 cases of mania, 7,250 cases of aggression. I mean, this is big stuff.
It's huge. It's huge. What do you see overall, everything we've talked about today, the FDA supplements, pharmaceutical drugs, over-medicating, GMOs, NSA? I mean, we're getting bombarded with all this lunacy, aren't we, Jonathan?
Well, we are. You know, it's a symptom of unaccountable government. I mean, we are victims of an unaccountable rogue government. You've got political motivations leading to things like, you know, the Department of Justice surveillance of Fox News reporter James Rosen and the AP reporters. Over 100 AP reporters were surveilled by the Department of Justice in their New York and Washington, Hartford, Connecticut offices and out of the House of Representatives press gallery. And James Rosen's email and phone records and his parents. And you've got the NSA surveillance of millions of Americans' email correspondence and phone records. And then you've got the IRS discriminating against conservative groups in the tax-exempt division. And you have that being done systematically. And you have all of these things going on at once. This is, without a doubt, the most corrupt government in American history. And no one is being made to account. And the abuses occur daily. And people are so smug. I mean, you get these people like Lois Lerner, you know, testifying on Capitol Hill and asserting the Fifth Amendment. And these people are still on the government payroll. And they're even getting bonuses.
Jeez.
There's no accountability.
No, there's none at all. Here's the question, though, Jonathan. Why is it happening? Why is all this going on?
Well, it's something, you know, interestingly enough, that the Founding Fathers predicted of government. It's interesting that, you know, here we are on the eve of the 4th of July, and our founders understood that there was an inherent danger in government of abuse and that the people's liberties would be at stake. And as they formed this great Constitution with a Bill of Rights that would protect individuals' liberties, they asked themselves the question, is this merely a parchment barrier? Will people come into power who will ignore these limits on power and will abuse their offices for their own advantage and will violate the people's liberties? And they predicted that indeed that would happen. It was Jefferson who said that every couple of decades we ought to have a revolution in this country. And whether it was political or military, it's uncertain, but he probably meant a political revolution where you would reassert the rights of the people against the abuses of government. It was even in his own administration, shortly after he had assumed office in 1802, he writes to Thomas Cooper, I think we have more machinery of government than is necessary, too many parasites living on the laborers of the industrious. And that was so early with a fledgling government that's only minuscule compared to today. The government has become so big, George. The regulatory state is so huge. 9/10 of all federal law, the product of the regulators, not those we elect to office. I write about this in my book, The Rise of Tyranny. It is unaccountable and it's out of control, and the rights violations take place almost without any notice.
And daily. Jonathan, we're going to come back, talk more, and phone calls with you next on Coast to Coast AM. An hour of your phone calls and comments with Jonathan Emord. You know the subjects. FDA approval of unsafe drugs, a supplement bill to do away with vitamins, or at least have to get them maybe by prescription, GMOs, the NSA surveillance. We've got them all next on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast, Jonathan, have you ever seen a time where so many things were just being under attack?
No, this is really an extraordinary time in a negative sort of way because the encroachment on individual liberty by the government could never be greater than it is now. We have transformed our government since the 1930s to the present from a limited federal republic into an unlimited bureaucratic oligarchy in which accountability is gone. And, we are at this stage. Remember, Obama ran on the pledge of transparent government. And the notion, if I worked in the bureaucracy in the Reagan administration and the Federal Communications Commission, the notion that a bureaucrat in the IRS, in the tax-exempt division, would start targeting conservative groups without a clear direction from above is really hard to fathom.
Sure.
Everybody in the bureaucracy tries to avoid becoming a scapegoat because scapegoating is the most popular thing inside the government when there's a problem that the media exposes. So these guys realize when they're working in the tax-exempt division that they're not going to undertake this kind of activity unless there's a clear direction. Well, we know that the IRS Commissioner Shulman approved that. But, the IRS Commissioner would not go out on a limb and systematically have this type of thing done unless somebody higher up from him in the White House gave him a green light for it. And it's hard to believe that the White House isn't involved with that IRS discrimination, which is unlawful, and also with the DOJ surveillance, which violates the First Amendment. So we get back to the old Watergate question. What did Obama know and when did he know it? And if not Obama, if he didn't know anything, well, my goodness, the buck does stop at the president's desk. It really does. And when you have all of these scandals going on simultaneously at the IRS, at the NSA, at the Department of Justice, and at the FDA, and at other agencies inside the government, too. This is just the tip of the iceberg. If we exposed more, you would see these kinds of things happening at the Environmental Protection Agency, for example. And we have to ask ourselves, why is it that people in government service are so routinely committing violations of law, violating individual civil rights, and engaging in self-interested feathering of their own nests by favoring one industry over another?
Yeah.
We have that instance here with the IRS director where Greg Roseman, where he gives to Braulio Castillo, who's a friend of Roseman's in this company called Strongcastle, an IRS grant of $500 million.
Oh, my God.
And this is supposed to go to disabled veterans, and this guy Castillo is not a veteran, and he's not disabled, and he writes in his application that he played sports at a military prep school in 1984 and suffered a foot injury. And they give him $500 million.
What was he going to do with it?
Well, I guess he's got he can compete with with dictators in foreign countries to acquire an island and
with that
make
kind of
his own
money.
republic. The figures are staggering. Obama goes to Africa, $100 million gone on a trip that did what?
Yeah, doesn't make any sense. Let's take some calls here, Jonathan. They're lining up here for you. First-time caller, Ray in Atlanta, Georgia. Ray, thanks for calling. You're on with us. Go ahead.
Hey, George. Hey, Jonathan. How are you?
Good.
Great. How are you?
Hey, good. I do stand-up comedy, and I get a little anxious. I get some anxiety. So I went to the doctor. He wanted to give me certain things. And my sister said I should take valerian root. And I told her, I said, what's that? It's for relaxation. And I said, well, why didn't the doctor tell me that? She said, well, they don't want you to know that. And I thought that was very disturbing that a doctor can't even, talk about valerian root, what it's for.
Some doctors, Jonathan, will work with holistic type medicine. Others, of course, don't want anything to do with it. Ray's absolutely correct. How do you find the right doctor?
Well, Ray is right, and it is hard to find the right doctor. I can give you some recommendations, but recognize what's operating here. You have medical boards in the states that are comprised of people who are conventional practitioners, and they're politically appointed, usually by the governor, and they police the industry, oftentimes going after with a vengeance those who deviate from the standard of care, in addition, which is conventional practice. In addition, you've got Medicare and the insurance companies lording over doctors, and if they deviate in any way, if they are outliers in any way, they are subject to audits. They can have to be forced to reimburse Medicare, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. So when a doctor makes a decision not to just be a pill pusher and not to follow that strictly conventional path, he's opening himself up to greater liability, more investigation, a higher degree of scrutiny from the state and the federal government. That's why even ones who have a conscience early in their career, which is oftentimes the case, the young doctor is usually driven by ideology, and the old doctor might be soured by the realities of the world, become more self-centered in some respects. So you end up with people who, for their own skin, are avoiding giving that advice out. And it's the exceptional doctor. If you look for integrative medicine doctors, you can find them. You have to be careful, because some folks are charlatans. They're charlatans in conventional medicine. They're charlatans in alternative medicine. The best advice, I think, is to look for an integrative medicine a doctor or center. And, one great one is at the University of Arizona. They have a great, huge integrative medicine center, and it's very well run. Andrew Weil is associated with it. Mm-hmm. It's really a well-run operation, and they do some very good work, and they help a lot of people.
Good idea. Gregory, Big Island in Hawaii, west of the Rockies. Greg, go ahead.
Aloha, fellows.
Hello, Gregory.
Just have a couple of comments. I'll keep it brief, and I'll take your reactions off the air.
Okay.
I have a proposal that will solve or address all the issues you guys have been discussing, and it would be very simple. What I propose is we change the paradigm that we're in now and evolve it to a higher form and go to a system of digital direct democracy using Social Security numbers and the combination of cell phones and computers to literally have national referendums and votes, let's say hypothetically every 60 days or 90 days. You could have national town halls and discussions and debates on social media and regular media, and then have a vote on a referendum or a law or an issue to change a government bureaucracy or division or whatever. And if an issue wasn't working, then the next cycle we could have another referendum and change something again, modify it again. If we were representing ourselves, and truly we are the people, then we wouldn't necessarily need representatives to represent us. Do you follow me? Thank you very much, gentlemen. Right. Have a good evening.
I'm a little leery of putting more electronics in the hands of these people, Jonathan. Your thoughts?
Well, we have what's called a mixed constitution. We don't have a pure democracy. We have elected offices, and then we have appointed judges of the Supreme Court, and we don't have direct voting on legislation. We have indirect by those we elect, a representative democracy in that sense. But the notion of a pure democracy really is a dangerous one, and the reason for that is there is a tyranny of the majority. You have to protect the interests and rights of the minority. The Founding Fathers understood this well in forming the Constitution. They feared unbridled democracy because of the fact that, say, in a time of national crisis, there can be, like we had with the McCarthy era, you can have scapegoating where you look for communists, people who be labeled communists, or otherwise labeled enemies of the Republic, and they can then be brutally treated. Their rights can be violated based on a majoritarian rule kind of system. So I'm a fan of the original Constitution. I very much believe in a limited federal republic. I'm not a friend of a very energetic government. It is always oppressive, said Thomas Jefferson. And I agree with that. And Jefferson also said, a wise and frugal government shall restrain men from injuring one another, shall leave them otherwise free to regulate their pursuits of industry and improvement, and shall not take from the mouth of labor the bread it has earned. This is the sum of good government, Jefferson said. I agree with that. I believe that a government is best which governs least. And I do believe that if there's a way for us to resolve our problems without resorting to government, we ought to do it. Yet within the realm of the Democratic branches, I think your caller has a good point, and that is there's got to be a better system of voting than what is common in the states today. There's too much voter fraud. There's too much abuse. There's too much intimidation. We'd like to think that our elections are fair and free, and perhaps by and large they are. But my goodness, we keep getting these reports of abuses, and there has to be a better way to simply record a person's preference in an election than a system that, we presently have with people who are oftentimes intimidated, or their votes aren't properly counted, or they're absolutely restricted in some way from even reaching the polls.
Are these people imbeciles, Jonathan? Don't they know eventually we're going to catch them?
Well, it's an arrogance, It never ceases to amaze me, George, at just how arrogant people can be, like this fellow Roseman. Did he really think? I guess they believe that they can get away with it. Remember that one congressman from the South that accepted a bribe from an FBI informant, an FBI sting operation, and put the money in his fridge?
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, you can't make this stuff up. The truth is more amazing than fiction. It's an arrogance. There was a member of Congress from the south side of Chicago years ago who was selling cocaine out of his office on Capitol Hill. What causes these people in public office to become so arrogant and so unaccountable that they will think they can get away with breaking the law, think they can get away? Congress exempts itself from Obamacare, for example. Well, if Obamacare is supposedly good for the American public, which I greatly disagree with that conclusion, but supposedly good for the American public, why would Congress exempt itself from it? Why does Congress consistently exempt itself from burdens in legislation?
That's a good question. Let's go to South Florida. Kevin's turn on Coast to Coast. Go ahead, Kev.
Guys, I love you guys' shows. I got to say, this Founding Fathers knew what was going on, okay? Whether they felt that there was mold, they had mold, whether British, who knows? But they came up to their own. They came up with some symbols, and I believe they looked in some sort of portal to see how our Constitution was going to be trying to take over. People was trying to take over our Constitution. That's all we have, guys. And I think if we want to keep our unity, our only chance that we have is to sort of protect the Constitution at all costs, because I know that, now they're trying to legalize going over the counter. They want to diagnose us. They don't want the masses to decide to whether to medicate themselves, because it's your choice. They don't want you to choose. And I think this is just only the tip of the iceberg. They're going to try to medicate us all and diagnose us all. And by, just like the guy shrinking the size of Slurpees in New York, and the Snicker bars is no longer big Snicker bars, it's an inch shorter. What's next, guys? And that's what I'm saying. They're trying to stop us from choosing. It's almost as like our government has secretly been toppled and shift of power, and these new entities are trying to decide how to reevaluate us and how to genetically engineer us. And that's what I feel like. We're being reevaluated by a new entity, and it's scary. It's almost like we lost, and like new aliens or whoever is taking over. It's a scary situation. We need to protect our Constitution at all costs.
Have we been infiltrated, Jonathan? I mean, what has happened here?
It's an excessive trust in essentially a nanny state, government paternalism. And your caller's quite right. Our choices are increasingly taken away from us. For example, just one example, many, many examples. The FDA refuses to allow the American people to have at the point of sale in grocery stores and in health food stores scientific literature that discusses the effects of nutrients on disease. Absolutely forbidden.
You can't say anything. Yep, you're right.
And that prohibition is absolute, even if the statements contained in it are demonstrably true, even if you were to slap a sticker on there that said, this is preliminary science. It does not matter. The government does not trust the American people to decide for themselves, to exercise freedom of choice in assessing the relative merits on scientific grounds of foods and dietary supplements, and yet, and not even of drugs, because they restrict the information going to doctors. They don't allow it to freely go to the American public. And so there's this paternalism that the FDA has to make basic food choices for the American people by depriving them of information that would enable them to exercise informed choice in the marketplace. And that's not just there. I mean, look, we should be able to make basic decisions about the relative worth of something that we want to buy without the government constantly second-guessing it, constantly presuming that we're too ignorant, constantly presuming that unless they structure a marketplace by creating barriers to some companies and giving others free rein, that they can't trust us to come to an end that will be one that advances humanity and improves the overall condition.
We're going to come back, Jonathan, and take final calls with you on Coast to Coast AM. Well, next hour on Coast to Coast AM, we're going to be talking about triangular-shaped UFOs, a classic Coast to Coast show. When we come back in a moment with Jonathan Emord, we will take final phone calls right here on Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back. Jonathan Emord with us, and, of course, we'll take your final calls. Jonathan, what's new with you? What are you working on?
Well, we're doing a number of things. We mentioned the action there with in Connecticut. We also are trying to prevent the Department of Health and Human Services, more particularly the Center for Medicaid Services, from limiting medical nutrition therapy to registered dietitians. The registered dietitians lobby, the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, used to be called the American Dietetic Association, lobbied to try to get a monopoly on medical nutrition therapy through Obamacare. And CMS was going along with it and proposed to limit medical nutrition therapy to registered dietitians, so that registered dietitians in hospitals would be the only ones you would see when discussing what kind of food and nutrition you would get in the hospital. And there are all kinds of people with, the typical dietitian has a bachelor's degree, but there are people who have the CNS credential, Certified Nutrition Specialist credential, that have graduate level degrees in nutrition who may not have the registered dietitian. Historically, dietitians have been food processing people. They haven't been medical people. So you've got all these experts, PhDs, master's degrees in nutrition and parenteral nutrition and enteral nutrition who are excluded from this thing. So on behalf of a group, including the Certification Board for Nutrition Specialists and others, we petitioned to open this up so that other professionals can be in there so that the registered dietitians don't get a monopoly through Obamacare.
Good point. Okay, final calls. Palm Desert we go. That's in California, of course. Jeff's with us. Jeff, go ahead.
Gentlemen, thanks for taking my call.
Sure thing.
I've got a statement, and then I have a question. It's just amazing. I mean, we've got a president that admits that he's used drugs, smoked pot, snorted coke, etc. And then you find out the State Department smuggling drugs and snorting drugs and pedophilia. You had the Secret Service agents in Colombia, bringing home prostitutes, and the only reason they got caught is because they didn't want to pay them. But what really strikes me about this whole thing, and it does start from the top, is the lack of truthfulness. I mean, just blatant lies. Like when he came on the show the other day or spoke, and he said 98% of all climatologists agree there's global warming. Well, there is not 98% agreement. This guy just opens his mouth and nothing comes out but fictitious information. And so everybody below sees it's okay and sees how it goes, and I'm just assuming that the one word I lean on is karma, and we all have our own karma, and I just hope they all, at whatever point on this earth or the next place we go, that they get caught. My question is, I read somewhere that Monsanto and some of these GMO corporations are above the law, that they cannot be sued. They can't get in any trouble, and that's ridiculous. If you find out, let's say, autism is caused by some of these GMOs or something like that, but yet they've taken them off the playing field, and there is no retribution for these large companies.
Have they been protected, Jonathan?
Yes, there are legal strictures in place to protect them from liability, and it's just an outrageous circumstance. Your caller's right. Anyone who is shielded from liability for products that they make has entered into a corrupt deal with the government doing the part of protecting their market and ensuring that even harmful things can continue to be sold without legal liability. So this is, your caller's right. I mean, this is a characteristic of a government that has run riot and gone astray from the constitutional moorings that defined a great country. And it's so tragic for our nation. Ultimately, I believe, as you do, George, that this will all come about. The national debt, $17 trillion, unsustainable growth of government, cost of government impossible to maintain, tax base that can't afford it. It's going to collapse. And when it does, I think, or perhaps immediately before it does, the American people, I hope, will reach a consensus that liberty is the most important thing, that the Founding Fathers had it right, that while we have to take responsibility for ourselves, it is better to be free and responsible than to be a slave and have all of your choices made by the government. And, Thomas Paine, September 12, 1777, in the middle of the Revolutionary War, said this. He said, "Those who expect to reap the blessings of freedom must undergo the fatigue of supporting it." And that's really what this is about. We have to reach a consensus in this country that we have had enough, that we aren't going to take it anymore, that we demand that a smaller, more efficient and effective government, that we wish to take on all of the functions that the government has deprived us of to the extent that they are possible without us causing injury to another person. We should be free to make these choices. We should be free to live our lives and pursue our industry and improvement without the government second-guessing every move, requiring us to get a license for everything that we do, and limiting our choices in the market because they think that, well, this one green company is better than the old industrial company.
Yeah. Near the Poconos in Pennsylvania, Joseph's with us, east of the Rockies. Joseph, go ahead.
Oh, good morning. Good morning, all. I have a question. I'm kind of a pro-supplement. Here's my problem, labeling. They're labeling these things, take them each and every day. It doesn't work that way. And second of all, what they're cutting their pills with, the cellulose and things like that. Mm-hmm. That's what I have my problem with supplements, because they do work, but not everybody's the same to say, take 2 of these each and every day, and they're cutting it with cellulose. Say, for example, myself, I can only take calcium as calcium lactate, which is the powder form, and I can't take the pills because they're like eating rocks.
Okay, so what do you do about that, Jonathan? He's
I think
right.
We have to, in all areas, but particularly in areas where we're ingesting things, we have to become sophisticated consumers. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we'll get exactly what we would want. I would wish that were so, but it may not be possible at any particular time. For example, in the processing of a supplement, clumping or caking or humidity effects may require some ingredient to be inserted that prevents that just in order to be able to put it into a capsule. But I think that the level of awareness or consciousness about limiting excipients and fillers in these products has become much greater, so that if you look at supplement composition just 5 or 6 years ago, it really has evolved so that you're getting quite a higher quality product today, and I suspect it'll get higher and higher over time just through the intense competition that is in that marketplace. Branding is quite good, and you find distinguishing characteristics. So while it's kind of tough to find the products that you may want, there are really good companies out there, and they do a fine job of ensuring the integrity of their products. It just takes a little digging, I think, to find them.
Joe, upstate New York. Joe, thank you for calling. Go ahead.
How you doing today, guys?
Good, Joe.
With all the stuff Obama's doing, with all this stuff, why isn't anybody talking about impeachment?
Well, I don't know. Why isn't anybody talking about impeachment? Has he done anything impeachable yet where people have proven that he's done these things, John?
Well, I think that we are at the stage where that question should come up, because
you are okay.
I do. I think we don't have direct evidence that President Obama has undertaken an illegal activity with regard to the DOJ surveillance of the reporters, or with regard to the IRS actions, which are more directly impeachable offenses.
Yes.
But I think it's very hard to believe that he was not involved. And there should be a special prosecutor appointed by Congress, and they should conduct an investigation to determine the extent to which the White House was involved and the president was involved. We're at the stage, essentially, as it was in the Watergate period, where the crimes have been committed, but the question arises, what did the president know and when did he know it? And that's where we're at, and we should be investigating this. There should be a special prosecutor, and we should determine the extent to which Obama is liable for these crimes and determine whether he should be open for impeachment. It's the only fair thing to do. Government, as I said, is chronically trying to find scapegoats. They got rid of Shulman. They got rid of other people in the government and in the IRS, but that doesn't answer the question. Who caused this to happen? And if that is the President of the United States, he should have to account under the law. No one is above the law. The president is not above the law. He has to be made to account.
Somebody did it. Let's go to Ketchikan, Alaska. Hey, Jay, go ahead.
Hi.
Hi, Jay.
I was reading today how the State Department, the propaganda wing, the Bureau of International Information Programs, it used to be called U.S. Information Agency, was artificially pumping up their Facebook pages by buying likes, on Facebook and other, like Twitter and that kind of thing, and which I don't know why they're even doing that, but the Office of the Inspector General did a 50-page report, and they spent $630,000 on, the State Department spent that money on trying to pump up their Facebook pages.
Their social networking. Unbelievable.
Yeah, and the Office of Inspector General just kind of said, well, they probably should have went about it differently or whatever, which, it tells me that the OIG is pretty much a waste of time. Self-auditing in the government's not any good, and I just was wondering what your guest thought of that. And then I have another question real quick. I found out, and I didn't know this, that when Canada back in the 60s started to enact their health care system, that the doctors went on strike, and I knew doctors had struck in Canada before, but we had to supply doctors and nurses to Canada to cover for the shortage while they were on strike. And I was wondering if your guest thought that doctors here would ever go on strike.
Well, I don't know if they'll go on strike, but they may just shut down, as some of them might be doing in Houston. What do you think, John?
Yeah, I agree with you, George. I think what we're likely to see is an extreme shortage of doctors, rationing of care, and this is exacerbated by Obamacare quite considerably. The more you regulate the market and deprive people of being able to earn money or to practice a profession based on independent professional judgment, which is what Obamacare does, you have to expect that people who pride themselves on integrity and on professional judgment will go elsewhere, and that's already in the works. The numbers of kids going into medical school are down. There's already an anticipated shortage, and it's getting much worse. But on this other point about the Inspector General that your caller raises, this is a good one. When the Inspector Generals are inside agencies, oftentimes there is a political aspect that works against truth and against revelation of wrongdoing. It's not that they don't reveal these things. It's oftentimes that they will have explanations for it, which are really gratuitous and don't really shouldn't be there. But there is an exception. For example, the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration, J. Russell George, is an absolute American hero. He's the one who exposed all of these IRS scandals, the $4 billion paid annually to illegal aliens through the additional child tax credit, the $50 million in tax dollars wasted on lavish IRS parties and conferences, $4 million just on one California conference alone. And more. I mean, he revealed the discriminatory treatment of conservative groups, and he did this because he is in the Treasury Department overseeing the IRS, so he's independent of the IRS. And not only that, I mean, the man has a stellar character. This is a patriot. This is a person who is a true American hero out there. It's a bright light. And he's done more to reveal corruption in this government and to transform this government than any single person. He's a courageous individual, and he's a very bright individual and very dedicated. And by the way, it's kind of funny, he dated Michelle Obama in law school for a short time.
Small world. Ray, truck driving in Tennessee. Go ahead, Ray.
Yeah, good morning, George. Listen, I'll try to make this quick. It's kind of hard to talk about. Jonathan, about 2 years ago, my son came to live with me. He was 19 years old. One of the things his mother said when he came to live with us was make sure he takes his medication. I know my son was a little depressed sometimes, but I didn't know all the extent of everything. I was home one day watching TV. He walked in the room. I didn't even see him walk in. He shot my nephew, who was 18. Then he shot himself in front of me.
Okay.
During the funeral, I asked the psychologist, I said, what did I do wrong? What didn't I see? and he said he just went into a mania, whatever. I didn't know. I never heard that word before. But going through his stuff after he died, I found all those pill bottles that you were talking about. There's the names of the pill bottles. Is this something that's normal? I mean, this happen a lot? I mean, does this kind of thing happen a lot with these pills?
Well, let me just at first say how very much I'm sorry that you had to go through this experience, and it's awful, horrific thing. The worst thing in the world, I think, for a parent is to see something happen adverse to their child, and nothing greater. There's no greater horror, I think, than to lose a child. I think that your report is really one that is becoming part of a chorus across the country as parents begin to realize that the drugs they have been given to treat their children, these psychiatric drugs, oftentimes carry with them side effects that can produce a much worse circumstance, such as a murder or homicide or suicide. And it's not the case that information is hidden. I mean, it's all over the world. It's been published. It's, as I say, on the drugs now, black box warnings saying that increases the risk of suicidality. But the psychiatrists and psychologists out there have actually made a business out of these psychiatric drugs. You know, years ago, psychiatry and psychology was considered by mainstream medicine to be on the fringe. But when psychiatrists and psychologists got together with the drug industry and they started pumping out all of these drugs, which oftentimes are no better than placebo in treating mental health conditions, they found a niche that legitimized them within medicine through the drug industry legitimizing them. And now people are routinely sent to them, and they oftentimes prescribe these things. Something like 70% or more of kids who are prescribed Ritalin are misdiagnosed for ADHD or ADD.
It's just a tragedy. Jonathan, thank you so much for being on the show. Jonathan's website linked up at coasttocoastam.com. In a moment, triangular-shaped UFOs. They seem to be everywhere. Why? And now a classic Coast to Coast for you. We're going to talk about triangular-shaped UFOs, an estimate of the situation. David Marler joins us. Stand by on Coast to Coast AM. Okay, welcome back to Coast. Let me tell you a little bit about David Marler. He's got a lifetime interest in the subject of UFOs, as many of us do. He joined the Mutual UFO Network back in 1990, field investigator trainee. Since then, he has served as a field investigator, state section director, as well as the Illinois state director. David, currently an independent UFO researcher, striving to find an open mind regarding the UFO phenomenon. However, he also acknowledges the need for somewhat of a skeptical approach when examining each individual UFO report. And here he is back on Coast to Coast as we talk about triangular-shaped UFOs, his latest work. David, how are you?
I'm doing fine. Good morning, George.
You too. Still in Illinois these days?
I am not, actually. I'm in beautiful Albuquerque, New Mexico as of last year.
You've moved on. Well, they're all great areas. Illinois used to have a little horse farm near Springfield.
I knew you were familiar with the St. Louis area.
Love it, love it, love it. Anyways, tell me a little bit about yourself beyond what I just read.
Well, really, like you said, I had a lifetime interest since about the age of 5 years old. My father, a childhood friend of his, was a principal witness in a wave of UFO sightings back in 1973 in southern Missouri around a small town called Piedmont. And Dr. Harley Rutledge, a physics professor, wrote a book on the subject. And
sure did.
Really, ever since then, just kind of followed the UFO subject as I grew older around the St. Louis area, and had started investigating, become active in the UFO field back in 1990. And since then have really strived to investigate cases firsthand and, more importantly, collect a lot of historical UFO material, which I used to actually put together the book that was just recently published.
David, were you here when those police officers from Millstadt, Illinois, saw this huge triangular-shaped object?
I was, and I was actually the primary investigator on that case for the Mutual UFO Network, and that was one of the, I guess you could say, catalysts that really launched the idea of writing this book on the subject, because as you may recall, most of those eyewitnesses described a very large triangular UFO, very low altitude, and virtually, in most cases, silent, and in other cases, virtually silent.
Let's talk a little bit about that specific case.
Absolutely. Well, as I like to mention in the book, we had just gotten through the having a collective sigh of relief that the Y2K event didn't occur. We were still here come Monday morning and, had to go back to work. But a few days after that, on the morning of January 5th, 2000, a gentleman by the name of Melvern Knoll in an Illinois suburb of St. Louis called Highland, Illinois, was just returning from an over-the-road truck run. During the off-season, he was a truck driver, and during the summer season, he had a family fun time place where they had a miniature golf course and a number of other little family entertainment games and so forth. And he had just gotten into town. It was a very cold morning, January 5th, 2000, and he wanted to check the pipes in his business establishment. As he exited his truck and went into the building, he just happened to notice what he described as a bright star off on the northeast horizon. And he just gave it just a passing thought, went into the building, checked the pipes. Luckily, they hadn't burst, and everything looked fine. He exited the building, returning to his vehicle. He just happened to look back to the northeast. Noticed this bright star appeared larger, and it wasn't a star because apparently it was moving towards the southwest. He stood stationary next to his truck as he watched this light, which was affixed to a much larger object, which then moved over a tree line immediately to the south of his location. And as it passed by him to the south, he described it as looked like a flying house or a rectangular object with rectangular windows that were illuminated from the inside, shining outward. This obviously is not something he was used to seeing, so I like to describe him as the hero of the story because unlike most people that might just stand there with their mouths wide open, he had the forethought to immediately drive to the other end of town after he lost sight of this object as it moved to the southwest, notify the local police department, and ask them to contact the Lebanon, Illinois Police Department, which was a neighboring town in the general direction of where this object was headed. The dispatcher laughed quite a bit, as did some of the officers there, but they did, in fact, call out to the Lebanon police officer that was on duty, and that was Officer Ed Barton. And Officer Barton, having interviewed him, I can tell you firsthand, he had a wonderful sense of humor. Unfortunately, he's since passed, but he's actually on the dispatch tapes that we were able to obtain, and he states, if I happen to find it, what am I supposed to do with it? Which I think is a very legitimate statement. But he did drive to the east end of town and did observe two very bright lights with such intensity that he described it as looking like the Japanese rising sun battle flag. It had these intense beams of light. And he noticed that these two lights were moving to the south. So he immediately hopped on to Illinois 4, which heads in a southerly direction, and then it intersects with Illinois Route 4, or Route 50 rather, near Route 4, and then he headed to the east in an attempt to intercept this object or these lights that he was observing. As he exited the east end of Lebanon, he noticed that these lights were attached to what looked like a cigar-shaped object. As he continued to approach it, he pulled his squad car over off to the side of the road in a very rural area outside of Lebanon, and the object then made a course correction and then appeared to be moving toward him. He estimated the object was 500 to 1,000 feet above him, absolutely no sound, and as it approached, he could see a very distinct outline against the illuminated sky with the moon and the stars of a elongated, dark, triangular object, large white lights at each point of the triangle and a strobing red light in the center. Then the object, as he observed it, made a flat turn and then began to proceed in a southwesterly heading. He immediately reached in his squad car to radio the St. Clair County Dispatch to see if Scott Air Force Base could verify if they had any military aircraft in the area. As he reached in, he then came up with the microphone, and as he was rising up from his squad car, coming up through the window, he noticed that this object was now streaking off to the southwest. In just a matter of a second or two, it had disappeared. at which point he told the dispatcher, whatever it is, it's headed in the direction of Shiloh. If the Shiloh officer looks up, he can probably see it. At which point, another eyewitness comes into the picture, and that's Officer David Martin of the Shiloh Police Department. And he did, in fact, observe a triangular object with a slightly varied lighting pattern from what Officer Ed Barton described. The object was moving very slowly, then it made an abrupt jump or hyperleap further down the road where he was sitting in his squad car, and then it slowed down again and then moved off in a southwesterly trajectory.
It was an exciting case. Now, as you know, David, it was very close to Scott Air Force Base.
Very close, within about a mile, we estimate.
Does that mean that it's possible that that object could have come from Scott?
That is a very logical assumption, and that's one that the local St. Louis media and Southern Illinois media tended to gravitate towards. It's interesting because we did have all of these high-quality witnesses that observed this. They couldn't readily discount the fact that these officers saw something, but I think most people are much more comfortable with the military explanation, and certainly at the time I would be the first one to attest, being skeptical regarding UFO reports, that certainly is the most pragmatic explanation that we could come up with, that it's something military, and especially, as you point out, George, that it's so close to a major military base. However, we have no reports of this object taking off or landing at Scott Air Force Base. And the other interesting aspect is the fact that Scott Air Force Base, their radar system was down at that time, as verified by the FAA, who I contacted after this sighting took place. And in addition, the historical research that I conducted subsequent to my investigation of this case that bears striking similarities with other reports worldwide going back to at least the late 1800s.
And you would think that if this thing happened to be hidden at Scott, that somebody would be a whistleblower. I mean, I don't think you could keep that secret.
Especially after this many years. I mean, we're looking at essentially 13 years now since that case took place. And, 13 years, that's quite a long time, as you point out, that we don't have a whistleblower, we don't have someone come forward. But, of course, as I think you and much of your audience is aware of, these triangular objects are certainly nothing new. We've been having reports of these consistently now over the last 20-plus years, at least, that most people are aware of. And the prevalence rate of these objects, looking at the National UFO Reporting Center statistics, which, of course, is one of the largest bodies of raw reports that we have, when I was conducting my research into this particular subset of UFO reports, I found that other than the amorphous category of light, that the triangular object is actually the number one reported UFO based on the National UFO Reporting Center statistics. That was in 2004. And then last year in 2012, I verified that again to see if that trend, continued. And in fact, it does. So these triangular objects are definitely at the forefront of the UFO phenomenon as we see it today.
Well, and you remember the Phoenix case in 1997.
Absolutely.
Again, another huge triangular-shaped object. Was this one, was Phoenix bigger than the Millstat one? I think it was.
By far, yeah. The general estimate based on the police officers and the other eyewitnesses that came forward described the object anywhere between 200 and 300 feet in length. The object over Phoenix was estimated to be almost a mile wide.
David, we're now beginning to get a pretty clear understanding of the drones and the drone testings that this country has been doing. And I think it's been conducted over a number of years. The drones look awfully close to a lot of UFOs that people have described.
It's definitely making it harder for investigators to tease out which are drones and what are true UFOs. It's
correct.
As if our job wasn't difficult enough before the drones entered the picture.
I mean, it's conceivable that 95% of the cases are either natural, weather-related, or man-made. I think that's all conceivable, but still then that would give us 5% of the unknown, and that's a pretty big percent.
It's still a big percentage, and, I talk about the triangular objects. I describe them in my own terms as unambiguous UFO reports. I've been involved in investigations over the years where someone reports seeing a light that looks disc-shaped or elliptical, And then when I go out on location, if the light is still visible, I'll pull up the star charts, and they're looking at the planet Venus. And either due to atmospheric phenomena or due to their just poor eyesight or their visual acuity, they think that it looks more elliptical than what it is. These triangular objects, just based on their sheer size, I had a retired law enforcement officer and also a former Marine, personal friend of mine, who observed a triangular object, extremely large, again, around 200 to 300 feet in length, extremely low. This was just north of St. Louis in November of 2000, just about 10 months after the January 5th, 2000 case. He personally told me that it was so large and so low, you couldn't look at it. You had to look from left to right to appreciate the scale of this object. And when you have something like that, I think it removes it from many of these smaller UFO reports or these little points of light in the sky. I mean, when these witnesses state that they've seen these things, they've seen something. And, of course, the $64,000 question is, what are they seeing?
Exactly. Do people, David, describe some kind of texture to these craft?
They do. In fact, it's interesting. There's a case from January of 1972 going through the newspaper archives in southern Illinois. Again, within about a 20-mile radius of Scott Air Force Base, a young teenage couple were chased in their car on a county road outside of Bartelso, Illinois, by a triangular object. This was in the Metro East Journal back in the early 70s. And they described what looked like structure or girders on the underside of this object. And in fact, in England, there's a number of cases that I've documented through the assistance of Omar Fowler, a veteran UFO researcher who is also a pioneer in the investigation and the documentation of these triangular UFO reports, where they describe either a structured surface or a ribbed type of surface, but something that is completely counterintuitive to what we would envision as something that would be an aerodynamic body that would facilitate moving through the air.
How far back does some of these reports go that you investigate?
The earliest documented case I have is from 1882, and that was actually from the volume 46 of Scientific American. And it described that a group of individuals had observed two triangular luminous appearances on the upper limb of the moon. They were looking at the moon and saw these two triangular appearances. Then later they were replaced on the lower limb of the moon by two dark triangular appearances. And the two appeared to merge into one and then disappear. But that's just one of many. Donald Kehoe, the famous Donald Kehoe, founder of NICAP back in the 50s, in his first book, I had completely forgotten about this, but in doing my research, scouring the old UFO literature, in his first book, Flying Saucers Are Real, he described two different instances of triangular UFOs. One actually occurred in 1890, and he described these triangular objects being seen over the Dutch East Indies. And what's interesting is not the fact that they're triangular, but it goes into much more detail. It states that they were basically 100 feet on the base of the triangle and 200 feet in length. And some observers stated that they thought it might even be much larger than that. What's interesting is that beyond just the triangular shape, of course, that matches the scale of the January 5th case and also the famous Belgian wave from 1989 to 1991, where they described objects of basically the same dimension. And then Kehoe goes on to state that later in 1895, he described in England and Scotland that they had an invasion of triangular-shaped objects in the sky, similar to what was being seen in the Dutch East Indies. And what was interesting is that, they point out that, this is before aircraft and dirigibles were being seen at the time. But there was a lot of skepticism, but one astronomer states in the article that he believed that these things, whatever they were coming from outer space.
Huh. Now, you have talked to some aerospace experts.
I have. Actually, in the course of putting this together, I thought rather than going based on my assumptions, I go to the source. I go to the experts. I was able to enlist the aid of Professor John Allen, who is 92 years old. been involved in the aviation and aerospace industry his entire life. He's retired from British Aerospace, and I did an exhaustive interview with him for the book, and basically asked his opinion. And being somewhat skeptical and not being a quote-unquote UFO believer, he fully acknowledged the possibility that, some of these objects could be extraterrestrial. And it was interesting. He looked at one of the sketches in the rough draft of the book, and he states that, well, based on the outward appearance, that could be one of my Harrier jets, because he was one of the key engineers in developing the Harrier jet. And I said, well, the only problem with that, Professor Allen, is I've seen the Harrier jet at air shows, and I know that they're loud to the point where it literally vibrates your rib cage. It generates so much vibration and noise. And he states, well, but if they're seen at a distance, that may mitigate some of that sound. He goes, how close were these objects in this particular instance? I said, well, he wouldn't have stated it was directly above them. And he stated very cautiously, well, that doesn't sound like one of my Harriers.
No.
So he goes, that leaves you with a question, doesn't it? I said, yes, it indeed does.
Do these cases baffle you, David?
They do. They truly do. And especially looking at the rich history, as I'm sure you're aware, George, the UFO phenomenon in general has a rich history. But I decided to kind of take my research microscope and really focus on this particular subset of reports, really for two reasons. One, a lot of people were saying that these triangles are something new to the UFO.
Hold on for a second, David. We're already at the break. We're going to come back. We'll talk more on Coast to Coast AM. Well, you can sound off here at Coast to Coast AM. Simply send your sound off to editorial@coasttocoastam.com. That's an email address, editorial@coasttocoastam.com. Make it about a minute. Put your name and phone number in there. Sound off. It's part of our features here of Coast to Coast AM.
This is Eric in North Hollywood with my sound off. Thanks to Coast and the Internet, more and more of us are aware of how the insiders are out to take away our rights and freedoms, to spy on us, to penalize groups with political beliefs that threaten their evil plots, and to control our reality using their influence of the media, education, and medicine. But what really makes my blood boil is their use of the psychiatric/big pharmaceutical profit machine as a tool to dumb down the society and to actually create criminality and violence while raking in billions of our taxpayer and government dollars. Under the guise of so-called authority and legitimacy, an estimated 3,000 people are killed worldwide each month by psychiatric drugs. Every 20 seconds, a child in the U.S. takes a psych drug that can cause suicidal thoughts and actions. Just do a search on psychiatric fraud if you want to find out more. This is Eric in North Hollywood. This has been my sound off.
And welcome back. David Marler with us, author of Triangular UFOs, An Estimate of the Situation. David, right before the break, I was asking you if these cases even baffle you, and you were right in the middle of that. So I'll let you finish that up.
They do. I mean, it's just striking the dramatic nature of these reports, and again, I think more than anything, George, really the consistency of reports. Again, spanning decades and spanning worldwide, various countries, and essentially all describing the same thing. If it was just a triangular object they were reporting, that's one thing, but I've been able to essentially identify 20 common characteristics that continue to bear out, whether you're looking at, declassified Blue Book reports, Ministry of Defense files, newspaper archives. There's a consistent narrative that's being told here. And, for the first time, I wanted to try to assemble that information because a lot of people were under the misapprehension that when the Belgian wave occurred in 1989, that this was something new that we were suddenly confronted with. And rightly so at the time. Again, the most pragmatic explanation, well, this might be something military that's being tested. I have a case from 1936 at Klutna, Alaska, a gentleman that filed a report years ago and described this object moving overhead over him and a friend. He described it as looking like a flat iron. In other words, it was pointed at the front and flat at the back. I'd say that's roughly triangular. And even in 1936, they thought it was something that the government was doing, meaning military. And we hear that time and time again. The question is, where are these objects coming from and where are they going to? It's interesting that in reviewing all these hundreds of cases, I don't have any reports of triangular objects taking off or landing at any military facility or installation.
No, that's true. Do they talk about the speed of the craft? Or do they just lumber along too slowly?
They do. It's interesting. It really runs the spectrum. Like many other UFO reports, the objects are often stationary, and then in the blink of an eye, they immediately take off at a high rate of speed. Of note, and this was actually of interest to Dr. Paul Ziss, retired McDonnell Douglas engineer that I interviewed for the book. He was amazed with the January 5th, 2000 incident based on the estimated speed of the object as it streaked away from the Lebanon police officer, based on the fact that we have multiple witnesses and we're able to essentially establish a flight path of this object, that based on the estimates, this thing went supersonic, yet there was no sonic boom created. Now, that sounds interesting, but in the Belgian wave, when the F-16s were in pursuit of this triangular object, at the same time 4 ground-based NATO radar tracking stations were tracking the object went hypersonic, but yet there was no sonic boom created. So, again, one of those patterns that continue to seem to bear out over time.
Well, what about propulsion now? Can you estimate for us what you think the propulsion system might be?
I think a better way of saying it is what propulsion it's not utilizing.
Well, we know it's not utilizing our kind of propulsion.
Exactly. Well, the interesting thing with all of these reports is there's an absence of any type of emission, contrail, sound, other than a faint, on rare occasions, some of the witnesses describe a faint humming or buzzing sound. Nothing that would be associated with conventional jet aircraft or jet propulsion technology, absence of vertical stabilizers. And what's really interesting, one of the characteristics, and it bears out throughout the decades, and there's even a 1960s Blue Book case with an illustration, these triangular objects, we all acknowledge that we have triangular objects. The B-2 is roughly triangular, the F-117A stealth fighter. What is interesting is there are numerous cases of witnesses describing these triangular objects moving with the blunt end as the leading edge and the apex of the triangle trailing behind. And in discussing this with Professor Allen from British Aerospace, Dr. Paul Ziss with McDonnell Douglas, they've stated from an aerodynamic standpoint that makes absolutely no sense, and they can't make any sense of that. And Dr. Paul Ziss confided that whatever this object is utilizing in the way of propulsion, it's definitely something beyond conventional technologies.
John Alexander, our dear friend, wrote the foreword to your book, Triangular UFOs. Tell me about that.
Yeah, actually, that was kind of rather serendipitous, the way that happened. Last year, I was speaking at a UFO conference, the Eureka Springs UFO conference, that had been hosted by veteran UFO researcher Lou Farish. Unfortunately, Lou passed away last January, but I was speaking at that conference, and John Alexander was invited to speak at that same conference, and we had never met. And I was the first speaker, and I got up and gave my presentation. I've been lecturing on this subject for a very long time prior to writing the book, and it was interesting. I had a number of people that were asking me questions afterwards, and there were about 500 people present at this conference. And I noticed as I'm trying to answer questions, with these people that are surrounding me, I noticed this silver-haired gentleman kind of weaving his way through the audience and making a beeline path for me, and it was John Alexander. And he came up and shook my hand and said, "That's one of the best presentations I've heard at a UFO conference in quite a while." And that struck up a series of emails, phone conversations. He asked for more material based on my historical research. And, of course, in his own book, he talks about how he's fascinated by these triangular UFO reports. And similar to myself, he agrees that if you look at the history of these reports, we have to concede that at least not all of these objects that are being cited are military based on the historical argument. Certainly there may be some that are military in origin. We may be dealing with a mixture of the two. But actually leaving that conference, I had about 5 or 6 people ask me, can I buy a copy of your book? And rather embarrassingly, I had to tell them that I didn't have a book. And they had encouraged me. They said, well, you have some really good material here. I think it would make a great book. That, in conjunction with John Alexander's interest in the research, I decided at that point last year to start putting all my research together and essentially consolidate it into book form.
Well, good for you, because it's good, I think, for the industry, for the area of UFO research, to have works like this there, specializing in these certain areas, David.
It's interesting. Despite the prevalence of these reports, and my publisher Richard Dolan, he and I had conversations on this subject. Despite the prevalence of these reports, literally being at the forefront of this phenomenon today, there's never been a book dedicated to analyzing it. There certainly have been cases discussed in various UFO books, but never a book dedicated to the history, dedicated to establishing a working profile of these objects. So I kind of felt that there was a need for that, again, given the prevalence of these reports. And in my opinion, a lot of disinformation that's out there on the Internet regarding these objects.
Yes, I was just with Richard last weekend in Toronto.
Yes,
at my event. Boy, he did a great job for us too. He just dives into this field, doesn't he?
He does, and I personally feel honored that he approached me and said, "I would like to publish this book if you're going to write it." That's actually an author's dream. Usually you write a book and you pray to God someone will
pick it up,
find it of interest to publish it. I actually had Richard chomping at the bit saying, "Are you finished yet? Are you done? Are we ready to publish this?" And so to have someone of his caliber to not only have interest in the subject matter, but to have faith in me as a at least up to this point, an unpublished author, I was very gratified.
You've got some archival reports of old newspapers in the book. Kind of describe that for people, David.
Well, like I said, over the last 20 years now, 20 plus years, I've been able to be lucky enough to find some aging researchers that are in their 70s and 80s. These were the people that really got caught up in the initial wave of flying saucer reports back in the late 40s, early 50s. And a lot of these collectors are aging, and their family isn't interested in the subject. So I've been lucky enough to acquire a number of very large libraries regarding the UFO subject. And I have a lot of rare material that you just can't access readily on the Internet. Some of these reports are extremely interesting. There's a case in Denmark in 1957, actually 57 to 58. There was a wave of triangular UFO reports that was reported in the local newspapers. And what's interesting is we think Belgium, 1989 to 91, the military was interested. The Belgian military was interested. In 1957 and 1958, the Danish Defense Intelligence Network was actively investigating triangular UFO reports over Denmark. And I found that in one of the newspaper articles, and then was able to actually find corroborating articles through Reuters. There was a Reuters article April 19th of that year, and it described the sighting of a triangular object, very low altitude, dark. What was interesting, though, is that objects were seen emerging from the triangular craft. And it was a eyewitness. It was a woman that had 20 additional eyewitnesses that corroborated her testimony. And that's another characteristic. Oftentimes there are non-triangular UFOs seen in conjunction with these triangular UFOs, oftentimes entering or exiting these vehicles, which really makes it difficult to try to tease out when you're trying to group and categorize these various UFO reports.
Well, so what's your gut tell you, David? What do you think's going on?
Well, the best I can say, based on the information, is, again, some at least modern-day reports, and by modern day I mean within the last 20 years, some of these triangular objects most certainly could be military. However, based on historical evidence and the consistency that I found in just various newspaper archives, military reports, we are dealing with objects that are of non-terrestrial origin. And that's the best I can say. I obviously can't say where they're coming from, why are they here, are they being piloted, are they remotely operated craft? I don't know, but there is too much compelling information, well-documented information, not only eyewitness testimony, but radar confirmation in some cases of these objects. And I think that we need to really examine this subset of reports because despite the fact that in the 40s and the 50s and even into the 60s and 70s, we had the disc-shaped reports, which were certainly more prevalent. there is a consistent body of information of these triangular UFOs that have kind of always existed within the data. But in pulling that out and in really analyzing this particular subset of reports, I think it really gives us a different outlook on the UFO phenomenon. And I think it begs the question, what are these triangles and how do they fit into the larger framework of the UFO phenomenon in general?
Well, now, when people see them at night, do they seem to cloak themselves with the stars?
We do have some reports of that. In fact, one of the police officers from Millstadt, Illinois, described that on January 5th, 2000. He said it almost looked like the stars were being projected on the underside of this craft, like starfield camouflage. And that's extremely interesting. There's not a lot of testimony to that regard, but there are some. And again, that might be something that maybe we've created. That I certainly don't look to find a UFO, i.e. alien spacecraft, under every rock. I'm more than willing to concede that some of these objects may be military in origin.
You know, let's make the assumption that they are coming from other planetary systems. What do you think's going on there? Why are they coming here? Why have they been coming here?
Based on just my research, I can only go based on my research. I really don't want to go off on leaps of faith, but these objects have been here for a very long time. And certainly looking at the UFO subject in a much larger framework, we know that reports of unconventional aerial objects have been around for many, many decades and may stretch back into antiquity. If I were to guess, I would say it's a longitudinal study of epic proportions. In other words, we probably have intelligences that are observing our development on this planet over centuries or even, eons. But I think whatever they're doing, they obviously they have not overtly interfered with what we're doing.
Not that we know of, at least.
Not that we know of. That's a good point. However, there have been some very dramatic instances where accidents have occurred or almost have occurred. There was an air miss incident in England involving one of these objects, January 6, 1995, outside of Manchester Airport, that gained a lot of notoriety at the time, not only in England but worldwide. And this was well documented. This was actually investigated by the Civil Aviation Administration over there, and they were not able to come up with any type of resolution. But essentially, as they were coming in for landing at Manchester Airport around 6:48 p.m., this triangular object, this wedge-shaped object, just missed the right wing of the plane. It was a 737 coming in for approach, and both the pilot and the co-pilot, filed reports. They drew sketches. They, made their statements public. And again, this launched an investigation that took months, but ultimately they were not able to come to any resolution. But that's just one of the more dramatic instances that I came across, and that was directly out of the Ministry of Defense files that were declassified.
Any reports of these saucers abducting other crafts, grabbing them?
Not that I'm aware of. There are cases. There's a case from 1954 that occurred over the Canadian province of Labrador. And it was another instance where, again, there were non-triangular UFOs associated with this, but it was observed by a British overseas airway cruiser, and the entire crew and 51 passengers observed a triangular object and 6 attendant objects, which some people thought were saucer-shaped, and they appeared to be going inside and outside of this triangular object, and they viewed this for 18 full minutes.
Just amazing, isn't it?
It's amazing because some of this stuff is extremely well documented, and I think, when people review the information, this isn't coming from UFO sources. This isn't coming from NICAP or APRO or from UFO clubs. This is coming from mainstream media sources of the time. Like I said, Reuters, International News Service, Associated Press. These are mainstream stories that, unfortunately, as we know, occur sporadically across the world, and oftentimes they'll make the news one day and then, we sweep it under the carpet and we move on. But when you start consolidating all these reports and putting it together, it starts to paint a picture. And to your point, yes, it's amazing, and it really does make you wonder, what are we dealing with here?
It is amazing. It truly is. Now, Tell me a little bit about TR-3B, the aircraft hypothesis. What are we talking about there?
Again, I'll preface this by saying, in my opinion, there's a lot of references to a TR-3B military aircraft that has been discussed for, I'd say about 10 years now on the Internet at least. And what's interesting is that this is something that has developed a life of its own, in my opinion, on the Internet. People describe the fact that, A, we definitely have this. It's definitely military. Some people on the Internet have even stated how the craft operates. And then other people state, I was personally involved in the development of that aircraft. Well, I have a few concerns about that because a lot of the same people are saying this is what people are seeing in the sky today, that this is all military. All of these triangular objects are military. And again, to me, that flies in the face of the evidence that I've uncovered with the historical backdrop dating back to the late 1800s, which, if you can establish that we're dealing with the same type of objects going back that far, to me, it completely erodes the argument that these are military, or at least that some of these are military. Let me qualify that statement. But what's interesting is the fact you have some so-called government insiders that have come forward and stated that they've worked on these projects. This is the object. Here are the schematics. These are the fundamental aspects, how the craft operates. And yet these people have come forward and supposedly divulged classified information, yet they've never been held accountable for violating any secrecy oaths. So my argument is until they have verifiable evidence to back up their claims, they're just stories.
Well, but great stories nonetheless. David, we're coming back, final hour with you. We're going to open up the phone lines, questions and stories on Coast to Coast AM. This is the hour, the interactive portion of the show. We'll take your phone calls with David Marler. Questions and UFO stories on Coast to Coast AM. And David, again, what was it about the triangular-shaped objects that got you so specialized?
Well, I became fascinated, like most people, with the famous Belgian wave from 1989 to 1991. That's when I became active, actually, during that time period, 1990. So that was the hot topic at the time. And so I was interested in that, but at that point I was really trying to digest as much as I could regarding the UFO subject. It wasn't until almost 10 years later, in 2000, that I was suddenly confronted firsthand with these eyewitnesses in and around the area that I lived at the time that had observed it. And I having been familiar with the Belgian wave, I realized very quickly as I'm interviewing these police officers, they're describing essentially the same thing that the gendarmes reported 10 years prior in Belgium. And so once I established that there's some similarities here, I decided to slowly start delving into the historical documents and see if there's parallels between these two cases. Are there others? And, you know, over 13 years now, I've been able to collect all this information and compile it. And what I found is there is a consistent narrative being told.
Well, there is. And I'm glad you're there to record it, huh? So
it's been an uphill battle, but it's been rewarding, and I hope that people will enjoy reviewing the material, and more importantly, like I said, try to essentially dissolve this idea that these triangles are something new, because I think when confronted with the information that I've compiled, I think people will suddenly maybe take a different perspective on at least some of these reports.
All right, let's go to the phones. We'll go first of all to our first-time caller, Ferris in Goldsboro, North Carolina. Hi, Ferris. Go ahead.
Hi, I just wanted to touch base on something you fellows were talking about earlier about the propulsion of the triangular crafts and the humming also, because there's been a lot of hearing of humming, like something is hovering over them, but they can't see them. And you were talking about that cloak, and they have a cloak. It bends light around an area to where you can see what's behind it, and it's out there. And as far as the propulsion is concerned, I feel it's mainly magnetic. As far as the use of North and South poles, I heard somebody speak about it earlier. I'm not sure exactly the name of the device, but
well, you might be right.
I'm surprised that the scientists haven't realized that it could be magnetic.
Well, which could also then be anti-gravity, David, don't you think?
Absolutely. That's what we suspect. But in looking at some of the anti-gravity literature, there's a lot of different mechanisms that can potentially generate an anti-gravity field, and trying to understand what mechanism is at work that's actually creating that anti-gravity field, that's been fuel for some very interesting conversations with some of these aerospace experts I've been speaking with.
How does this break, this big story? What happens? What do you think is it going to take?
I think it's going to take a sighting of epic proportions, and how do I define that? It's going to have to be something even bigger than the Phoenix Lights case that you described earlier, George. I quite literally think it's going to have to be something like out of a Hollywood movie, where we're going to have a large triangular object hovering over the Pentagon or hovering over the White House, because we've seen time and time again, Phoenix Lights is a prime example. A lot of people accept the notion that it was just flares. People didn't see a UFO. It was just all flares. In my book, I talk about the famous Hudson Valley wave of UFO sightings. Extremely credible, multiple witness accounts over a 3-year period. But then you suddenly had the water muddied by having some private pilots go up in Cessnas with lights attached to the wings and flying in a rough V formation. Well, suddenly people generalize that to say, well, that explains all of the UFO sightings. Well, if you look at the facts, if you look at the reports, it clearly does not. But you sow the seed of doubt, and suddenly people then question the validity of all of the reports. And so we're going to need something that just simply cannot be explained away in conventional terms. And it's just going to take, I think, a sighting of epic proportions.
When you were the state project director for MUFON in Illinois, did you, besides the Millstat case, did you come across anything else that you found intriguing?
Well, yes, actually involving an apparent large triangular object. And this gets into that realm of sighting of epic proportions, but it was, of course, the famous Tinley Park, Illinois UFO sightings that occurred over Tinley Park, Orland Park, just to the south of Chicago, the greater Chicagoland area. And this involved hundreds, if not thousands, of eyewitnesses. Ozzy Osbourne, of all people, had just finished a concert, and people were leaving the Tweeter Center there at the time. And so they were almost in gridlock traffic. And as they're all sitting there, this array of 3 orange amber lights moves overhead, not making a sound, moving extremely slow, too slow to be an aircraft, not making any sound like a helicopter would make, or 3 helicopters in formation. And in point of fact, that occurred in August of that year, and then it occurred in October on Halloween night. And we have eyewitnesses that observed it in August and observed it in October, and in some cases videotaped the lights or the object. And this was, again, a sighting involving hundreds, if not thousands, of eyewitnesses spread over a large geographic, and I might add, highly populated area. And this was investigated very thoroughly by my friend Sam Moranto, who is the current MUFON State Director for Illinois.
Okay, let's go back to the phones. Joe in Tampa, Florida. Hey, Joseph. Go ahead, Joe.
How are you doing tonight?
Good.
I was wondering if this young man might know how far back these cylinder sightings go.
How back the what sightings go?
Cylinder sightings?
The cylinder shape.
Oh, the cylinders. Well, I haven't had the focus on that, but I do recall going back to the famous French wave of 1954. They had a lot of these cylinders that were reported over parts of France. And in that particular instance, the saucer or disc-shaped objects were seen coming out of the cylinder in a number of reports that were documented at the time.
Now, these days, David, what are you doing in the field of ufology?
Well, having just written this book, actually taking a small reprieve. But no, actually still collecting data, still collecting a lot of information. Certainly, I'm interested in the phenomenon in general, but triangles have been kind of the focus of my research. But I'm still in the process of collecting a lot of historical information. And really, other than UFOs being an interest of mine, I really have a passion for history and preserving history. And that spills over into the UFO area. So I'm really in the process of trying to catalog and preserve a lot of historical UFO information, some of it extremely rare.
Very rare indeed. That's exciting. Did you ever look at the Cape Girardeau case?
I've read up on it. I've not done any active investigation. I used to obviously live not very far from there, and I used to go to Cape Girardeau on business all the time. But it's an extremely interesting case, especially given the year that it occurred. It's one of those many crash accounts that is intriguing, but we always have that elusive hard evidence that we can't seem to get our hands on. And I even mentioned that regarding triangular UFOs. We really don't have any physical evidence other than eyewitness reports, certainly videos and photographs, which today certainly can be hoaxed very readily. But I'm intrigued by the cases that involve multiple witnesses that have radar confirmation. I think that gives us a little bit more to sink our teeth into from an investigative standpoint.
Let's go to Mount Kisco, New York. JR's with us. Hey, JR, good morning.
Good morning. How you doing? Hey,
good,
Dave. How are you?
I'm doing well.
Hey, I was about to really get on you because I didn't hear you say anything about the Hudson Valley UFO case.
I was going to say Mount Kisco. I have some newspaper accounts from Mount Kisco that I have in my book.
Yeah. Well, I grew up in Millwood, New York, and here's my story on that. So I was 13 years old. I was at a barbecue. It's about 7 o'clock at night, so, it was summer, perfectly light out. About 500 feet above our head, size of a football field, perfectly still. You could throw a rock at it. Unbelievable. Not a sound. It was the most unbelievable thing. And I just don't think that case is reported about. Most people don't really hear about it. When, you hear about the Belgian wave, you hear about the Phoenix Light, but most people don't hear about the Hudson Valley sighting. And
I agree, and I revisit
wondering
that.
why that doesn't get reported that much.
No, I completely agree with you. There's some dramatic reports, and I'm glad you have a firsthand account from that time period because, again, as I'm sure you heard, the ridiculous explanation that these were Cessna aircraft flying with lights connected. Obviously what you saw was not that. I mean, it was a stationary object, like you said. And it's an extremely interesting wave of UFO reports at that time and over a fairly concentrated area and by credible individuals like yourself. And, as, of course, a lot of police officers at the time reported seeing those objects.
Well, that's the important thing, too. I mean, when you get law enforcement involved and they see this, they're not kidding. There's something going on here.
No, they have a lot to lose by coming forward and reporting something like this as far as credibility, as far as the community is concerned. And I actually commend law enforcement for coming forward over the years with their reports because they do have a lot to lose and their reputations are on the line. But, when you see something this dramatic, I think you do feel compelled to report it to someone.
David, after your little hiatus, are you going to expand your UFO research?
I'm thinking I've got a few projects in mind. I really hate to commit myself by saying what they are, but I do have a few other areas I'm looking into. Again, I do have a wealth of historical material, and I think no matter what aspect of the UFO phenomenon we look at, we to your point earlier, George, you were talking about the January 5th, 2000 UFO sighting. Of course, it was sighted near Scott Air Force Base. But as I've done many interviews over the years and lectures to adult and school groups on that case, I say at the end of the day, we can investigate that case, but no UFO case exists in a vacuum. And we simply can't look at the January 5th case by itself. We have to view it in the context of these other historical cases. And I would argue any aspect of the UFO phenomenon, it should be the same way.
Well, I think you're right. Let's go to Roger in San Francisco, California. Hello, Roger. Go ahead.
Hi, George and David. David, you've mentioned a few times your interest in the history of these things. Would that extend to the medieval and Renaissance sightings, supposedly in paintings? And if you have an opinion, and I can help solve that mystery as a footnote if you all like.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think historically, any credible information we can get our hands on, I think, is important. I don't think we can ignore any one aspect of that. I think we have to view it in total.
Well, those objects in paintings, what they are actually is from the earlier late antiquities Christian art. if you look at the alphabet, the Greek alphabet, the Alpha and Omega,
yes,
the A is triangular shaped, and the lowercase O for Omega, Omicron, whatever it is, looks like our small lowercase m. So if you superimpose those two, you put like an arrow shape pointing up, and between the feet put a letter M. Then you rotate that 90 degrees, and it looks like a delta wing with like 3 flames coming out of it. So that's just the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. It's an old, very ancient Christian symbol. So in the Renaissance, they're, of course, reviving ancient sources of mysteries and religion and Greek history and blah, blah, blah. So that's where that's from. It's simply Alpha and Omega symbol that looks like a nose cone of an Apollo spacecraft or something.
Interesting. Yeah, I didn't in the book. I didn't go back quite that far. I only went to the late 1800s, but that's a very interesting interpretation of that. I really had never thought of it in that context.
Have you thought of this as being objects that come through other dimensions, the multiverse?
Well,
maybe they're demons?
At the end of the book, I try to make conclusions, tentative though they may be. I mean, obviously we don't have a lot of, as I mentioned to someone the other day, I'd like to think I haven't defined the answer, but I've helped refine the questions that we need to ask ourselves regarding these objects. But I really leave it open. I state in my conclusions that it could be spatial, temporal, or dimensional in origin, these objects, or all the above. Again,
or all of the above. That's
as an investigator, I think at the end of the day, and any UFO investigator that's out there that's done investigations and done research, really the thing that we can say is what these things are not. We can go through process of elimination to determine this is not a Harrier jet. This is not a conventional commercial aircraft. But at the end of the day, we really can't say what it was. Almost like the Air Force back during the Project Blue Book days, the best we can say is it's a genuine unknown.
And that's good enough for a lot of people, isn't it?
It's enough to fuel the imagination and certainly keep my interest in the subject.
Gary is in Delhart, Texas. Hello, Gary. Thanks. Go ahead.
Say, George, I got something on from Fox News. I have a direct TiVo machine. I recorded it. But during the Studio B with Shepard Smith today, when they were covering the Morrissey coup and all that, they showed the sky because they were showing helicopters and stuff, and they focus on this light in the sky, and then all of a sudden they realize it's not a helicopter, but it's an orb. It's a stop because the helicopters have like green strobe lights flashing around them and everything. This is a solid color orb. It's not about the shape of a diamond. And it's just slowly going across the sky. There's no smoke coming out of it. You can't see any blades. And the bottom of it is completely solid yellow. And then the top's kind of got waves of rainbowish colors on top. I'm looking at it right now because I recorded it on my direct TV. It says Fox News on the bottom, breaking news and everything. And I don't know if there's some way I think I can record this on my DVD and send this to you. But it is one of those orbs I'm sure that some of your UFO specialists have been talking about.
Yeah, you might be able to get it to us via your computer if you can download it.
Well, I don't have a computer.
Oh, you don't?
I don't have a computer, and I have no access to one. So I would probably have to record it on my DVD recorder and then just mail you the DVD.
Okay, you can do that.
But if there's a way, if you want to have one of your guys tell me how to do it, mail it to you, whatever, I'd be glad to. It was the whole hour show with Studio B with Shepard Smith, and this thing it's very obvious. It's an orb. It's got to be nothing but. And then the camera just all of a sudden goes away from it, and you see the screen go live. It says live, and they go right back to the crowd. It's almost like they knew what they had all of a sudden, then they realized they better not be recording it.
All right. Now, David, is it an orb or is it the drone?
Well, that's a good point. I was actually, as he's describing that, I'm thinking back to our earlier conversation. That would be something that we'd have to. I'd reserve judgment until I could see it. But, I think nowadays, George, we have to be very cautious about making any judgments because certainly we know we have a lot more unconventional objects in the sky, and many of those are built by us.
Well, as they say, you just never know, David. Where do we get your book, Triangular UFOs?
Well, you can go to richarddolanpress.com, or you can certainly go to amazon.com. It's available in hard copy as well as ebook.
All right, we're going to come back with you, David, and take final phone calls right here on Coast to Coast AM. Well, on our next Coast to Coast program, our Independence Night show, we're going to be live here for you Thursday and Friday. On the Thursday show, of course, Howard Bloom joins us as we talk about independence and the NSA, and then we're going to talk about disinformation, former Soviet spy chief revealing all kinds of information. So make sure you're part of that show. Friday, of course, we'll have those open lines on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. David Marlowe with us. We're talking about his work, Triangular UFOs, an estimate of the situation. What kind of other assistance did you get, David, when you wrote the book? Anybody give you additional feedback and input?
Yes, I thought a book of this nature, it would be good not just to have my own insights and my own research, but I tried to get some collaboration on the part of some leading researchers. I was able to work with Omar Fowler from England over the last several years and requested that he share his insights into the triangular UFO mystery. Although this is the first full-length book treatment of the subject, Mr. Fowler, back in the early mid-'90s, had written 2 small monographs, and he had been collecting a lot of case material. So Omar contributed. I had Dr. Mark Rodiger from CUFOS, Center for UFO Studies, George Wingfield, as well as Peter Davenport. And so I was able to get some collaboration on the part of other people to share their insights and some of their case material.
And Peter's a great guy, isn't he?
He's a dear friend. I've known Peter since he started at the National UFO Reporting Center, and dear friend and colleague, and absolutely. I can't think of all my years of investigating UFOs without thinking of Peter. I've had just so much interaction with him over the last couple decades.
Good for Peter. Good for you. Let's take final calls. Jeff is in Culver City, California. Hi, Jeff. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi, George and Mr. David Marveau. Yes, NASA just recently launched a tubular or cigar-shaped satellite into space from a large airplane. People have said that they've seen such objects in the skies years before. Given the fact that there are other crafts formed like hot air balloons, gigantic spinning tops, huge H-shaped satellites, and stealth aircraft, my question is this, Mr. Marveau. If these are truly government aircraft hovering above our heads, where did they acquire this technology so quickly in the last 100 years, since Orville and Wilbur Wright were just basically playing around with paper mache when they developed their first airplane? And I'll take your answer up there.
That's a good question, and that's one that's been kind of bannered about in the UFO field. Certainly there has been a huge evolution in technology. Technology tends to be exponential, though, in nature. I mean, one development leads to 2 or 3 other advances in various fields, but it's one of those areas where people have speculated, are we gathering this technology just through our own scientists, or are we somehow garnering this information from possibly recovered extraterrestrial devices? And unfortunately, I don't have any way of proving that one way or the other, but it's definitely food for thought. And really, when you do look, I mean, just, my mother's, 83 years old, and I think just what she has seen in her lifetime as far as the evolution in technology, it really does stagger the mind. And more importantly, not looking back, but looking forward. Where are we going to be, not just, in 20 or 30 years, just in 10 years? It really boggles the mind. Don't you agree, George?
Oh, there's no question about it. We're going to be so advanced. So many things will be happening. In terms of disclosure, David, let me ask you that. Do you think government will ever disclose? I don't.
I don't either, and I think you'll like the conclusion of my book, because I do address that, and I kind of state the rationale behind the cover-up. A lot of people talk about, well, why would the military, why would the government cover this up? And I think it's multifaceted, and I think this has been touched on by other researchers, but in my humble opinion, if let's put ourselves in a position of an authority figure, someone that has to maintain domestic tranquility, releasing this information without any type of responsible way of doing it there's no good that can come from it. I mean, we all have, I think on a personal level, that desire to know. We want to know. I know I certainly do. But, you just can't throw information out there. You have to look at the sociological ramifications. How is this going to impact our institutions, both religious, financial, et cetera? And then, really, if we are looking at, as some people have put forth, a cover-up that has occurred over many, many decades, in opening this up, it just opens up a whole can of worms, and it makes us reevaluate our history, makes us reevaluate our government institutions. I hate to say it, but it's Pandora's box. You're really opening up a whole can of worms, and I just don't see, if you're in a position of authority, what good comes of it. I really don't think that any government, United States or otherwise, is going to acknowledge a phenomenon that they can't control.
No, I agree there. Let's go to Tyler, Centralia, Washington. Hi, Tyler. Go ahead.
Hey, David.
Yes.
My father, who is a man who's honest to a fault, has told me this story a number of different occasions. Back in the 70s, his brother, his father, and one of their coworkers were in southeast Alaska at a log dump where they saw a V-shaped craft that came up out of the water, hovered for a moment, and then shot off into the atmosphere. No sound. I was just curious if you've heard of other crafts submerging or emerging from the water. I haven't myself. I thought it was interesting.
I've heard of other UFOs doing that. However, I will tell you, now that you mention that, in conducting the research for this book, I haven't come across any V-shaped or triangular objects that have behaved in that manner. So that's an interesting case. And you say that was southeast Alaska?
Yeah.
Okay.
I've heard a lot of submerged UFOs.
Yeah. The triangular objects, I haven't heard that about, but that's interesting. I'll have to look at a map and see. As I mentioned, there was a case from Eklutna, Alaska, in 1936. I'll have to take a look and just kind of see roughly where that is in relation to that.
What do you think of the Roswell case, David?
Something crashed. There's, George, just in the last 10 years, there have been so many variations on that narrative now. Everything from, Joseph Stalin being, involved and interested in the crash, and, were these human pilots in some type of test vehicle? Was it extraterrestrial? I really don't know. I think there's certainly something being covered up there, but what it is, I really don't know. I get asked that question all the time, and I'll be honest with you, I'm on the fence as far as what the nature of it is, but something crashed there, and I think there was definitely a cover-up, but what they were covering up, I'm still kind of ambiguous as far as that's concerned.
First-time caller, Bob, Wilkesboro, North Carolina. Hey, Bob, thanks.
Thanks a lot for taking my call. Mine is not a UFO story, but something happened to me that was awfully strange in the summer of 2000. That kind of involves, I guess you might say, alien, or I hate to use that word. I was staying overnight in Asheville, North Carolina. It's kind of a laid-back little town. And instead of eating out, I decided to shop at a small grocery store nearby. I went into the store, and I saw this. I'm a people watcher, and there's very few people in there. And there was this couple in there, a man and a woman, young, very, very tall, both wearing suits, a woman's suit and a man's suit, of course, light brown, looked Nordic. And I started shopping. And I was going up and down the aisles to get bread, mayo, a bottle of wine, and several other things. And they followed along behind me shopping also. This is kind of an odd thing. I never heard them speak, talk in any form, or communicate in any way. When I got through, they went in line ahead of me. And I noticed that they had bought exactly the same things that I had bought, down to the last item. And I got about 10 or 12 items. And the girl, when they checked, they left, and I wanted to go out and see what they'd driven up in, but I went ahead and paid. And the girl remarked, she says, "You got the same thing they did." And this has always perplexed me because it wasn't a joke. They weren't laughing or anything. And I know that if they were, Nordic or European, they certainly would have known English. And this has always bothered me, and I just wondered if David might have heard anything like this before.
That's a strange one, David.
That's very strange. I think that would definitely stick in my mind as well if I was in a grocery store and had something similar happen. I've not heard of anything like that, but I'd be curious. What was your interpretation of what do you speculate that was all about?
Well, I'm a skeptic, and I never really have seen anything that I couldn't explain in my own mind, as far as UFOs and that sort of thing. But it struck me at the moment that this is so unusual that this has to be something otherworldly, and I hate to use that term too. But I know I was in the Navy and traveled a lot, and I know, foreigners, most of them, especially Europe, know English, and it just seems so unreal. And it would have been a joke if they were laughing, but they weren't laughing. And they just struck me as so unusual that I could not. I've told a lot of people about this, and nobody can explain or offer any suggestions as to what this might have been.
They were ETs, David. They didn't know how to shop, so they decided to copy everything Bob picked out. That's my explanation. What do you think? You never know. Hey, all right, Bob, thanks for that story. Next up, we go to John, Long Island, New York. John, go ahead. You're up with us on Coast to Coast.
Good morning, George. Good morning, David.
Hey, John.
Since I know we don't believe in coincidence, I love how we tied giant triangles from last night's show into triangles from tonight's show. And if David has given any thought to what Richard has done with finding the power and talking about anti-gravity at the pyramids, and do we think there's any correlation between the two? I just thought it was a great segue from last night to tonight.
Well, I didn't hear last night's show, so I'm kind of at a disadvantage with regard to that. But I don't know. George, can you fill me in?
Well, last night we had Richard C. Hoagland on, David, and of course he was talking about all things space, specifically Mars.
Okay.
With artifacts that were there and things like that.
Oh, okay.
You know Hoagland, typical exciting Richard Hoagland.
Interesting. Yeah, I don't know if I could extrapolate any kind of ties to that, but it's certainly that's the thing that's really fascinating about this phenomenon. It's like, where are the parameters? Is all of this tied together? Are some of it tied together? Are we dealing with one phenomenon that just has far-reaching implications, or are we dealing with multiple phenomena that overlap each other?
Yeah, you could be. Okay, we go now to Orlando, Florida. Hello, Huey. It's your turn.
Hey, how are you guys? I love you guys' show. I listen to you all the time. And that other caller that just called and talked about, hey, listen, respect the Coast to Coast, okay? This is the best show in the universe. And then this is for you aliens that's listening. This is the best show in the universe. That other guy talking about, we should be fortunate as Earthlings, not as Americans, as Earthlings, to get special guests to come on the show every day, like David and Richard and Linda, and talk and educate us. They're one of the only people that have the kahunas to do what they do. So to all coast-to-coast listeners and all of the aliens and all of the conspiracy theorists, we have something that we human beings, we Earthlings have something that you will never be able to take away, and that's Coast to Coast. They're going to stay with us. Mr. Nori even said that if the end of the world occurs, that he's going to stay as a distance. He's going to stay with us. He's going to make sure that he stays. Who has the kahunas to stay with their listeners and go down with the ship? Mr. Nori, I respect you so much because you are one of my inspiration. You're not just here for the money. You're here because it's a planetary thing. It's a universal thing. It's not about packing up and going to your Rolls Royce and to your family. You're going to stay with us, and we need you. So, David, you're a hero. Linda, Richard, you're heroes, and I wish you guys the best, and I wish all other human beings.
Thank you so much. You are a walking promotion for us. I love it. I don't have a Rolls, by the way. I may have a spaceship, but I don't have a Rolls.
Yeah, that's one of the best endorsements I think I've ever heard.
David, a couple minutes to go. We'll take a few more final calls here, but I want to get your general overview, if you would, on this entire field of ufology, which all of us have. We've covered this since, we were younger. I mean, that's what fueled me getting into this business.
Yeah.
At the ripe age of 19 years old, when I, started studying things years before that. Mm-hmm. What do you think is happening?
Like I said earlier, I think maybe on some level, it's some type of longitudinal study where they're just simply observing us, almost like we'd observe a bacteria in a petri dish. And I know that's somewhat unsettling when you make a comparison like that, but if we are dealing with an advanced culture, the question is, and I raise this in the book, if we're dealing with that, how advanced could they be? When you look at the age of the universe and you look at the age of modern man, we're very relative newcomers to the scene. And so we could be dealing with things that are 1,000 or 1,000,000 years ahead of us in evolution. And they may just be observing us, maybe for entertainment. Certainly you look at the news and it's almost laughable sometimes what we see. But I think perhaps we're dealing with an intelligence that's just simply observing a primitive culture, developing, going into a new phase of evolution. But again, we may be dealing with multiple phenomena. And we're trying to take all this information and put it into one box, into one framework. And we may be doing ourselves a disservice in doing that. We may be dealing with multiple things, and we're trying to put it all together. And I think no matter whatever we're dealing with, it is definitely dynamic as we're finding out, as we're delving into these different areas. And what I would do is encourage people to go from just simply listening and maybe sitting on the sidelines, become active, become actively involved, find, like what I did, a particular aspect of the phenomenon and go after it and actively do what you think you can do to the best of your ability to try to find answers to what we're dealing with.
Okay, we go next to Eric in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Get you in real fast here. Eric, go ahead.
Okay, hey, how you guys doing today?
Good, Eric.
Doing well.
Okay, I got a couple questions, but the main one I really want to ask about is the Trumbull County in Ohio in 1994, how it was like 7 or 8 different cops were chasing a UFO. And, you always hear about people that would see these things are unreliable and stuff, but anymore you hear it's, cops or Air Force pilots or, pilots in general themselves. And I just really think it's an amazing thing that's going on.
Yeah, there's no question about it. I think, David, it's probably one of the greatest stories of our modern era.
I agree. And with regard to police officers, I mentioned that in the book. I state that if we have these police officers that are out patrolling, they're arresting people, they're taking accident reports, we view them as credible individuals. If they see an unidentified object in the sky and they report it, they're no less credible. Either these people are credible witnesses or they're not. You can't pick and choose when they're credible and when they're not. And, with these people, these police officers that have witnessed these UFOs, many of whom are still police officers. So clearly, we still view them as credible observers. So, if they're credible enough to testify to put someone in jail for a crime, then they should be credible enough and deemed equally credible when they report an unidentified flying object.
I think you're right. David, thank you so much. David Marler, his book, Triangular UFOs. For Dan Galante, Nathan Staten, Tom Danheiser, Lisa Lyon, Lex Lonehood, Sean Laudesor, Stephanie Smith, Chris Burrows, George Knapp, John B. Wells, Ian Punnett, and Art Bell. I'm George Norrie, somewhere out there on Coast to Coast AM. We'll see you on our next